Hey class, how are you? This is our lecture for the part of chapter 14 that deals with LGBTQ plus people. So there's some stuff in our book that's important. Uh, it's not really very thorough, and this lecture is not going to be super thorough, but I'm going to give you some additional information that will help you understand what we're talking about. So the acronym itself, LGBTQ. L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B stands for bisexual, T stands for transgender or trans, and Q stands for queer. There's other letters in there. I for intersex, A for asexual. So there's much more to it, and it's important to recall last chapter, women as a minority group. We talked about the gender binary, how when we are born, we are assigned a gender. We're assigned male or female generally, right? And that goes on our birth certificate generally, right? And so when we talk about trans and queer people in particular, we're talking about something that does not conform to this gender binary of male and female, right? So I have a link on Blackboard with regard to it's entitled the Gender Unicorn, and it kind of gives a little bit of an explanation. If you click on it, it talks about how gender identity, gender expression is much more of a fluid and or on a spectrum, right? It's not just like one or the other, right? So gender identity and gender expression can be like fluid, right? It can be variant, right, if you will. Also has some stuff with regard to physical attraction to women, men, under genders, emotional attraction as well, with regard to sexuality or affectional orientation. So also there is another clip in here, another link in here from Vice, which is entitled "What's the Difference Between Non-Binary, Gender Queer, and Gender Non-Conforming?" So these are some other additional terms that this link explains with regard to those that do not identify within this binary male-female dichotomy, right? So it gives some explanation of these terms, particularly gender queer and gender nonconforming. I don't know that I really care for the term gender nonconforming because it means literally means you're not conforming to gender when in fact you are doing gender. You are doing gender definitely. But anyway, I digress. So there's some helpful information to help explain a little bit what we're talking about with regard to in our country. The indigenous nations, with regard to when we talk about trans and queer people, when we talk about United States, indigenous nations oftentimes had what was called a two-spirit person, and that's a person that whose spirit encompasses both male and female, and these were like really revered people in indigenous cultures. Also, the concept of a third gender or multiple genders really or this idea of gender fluidity is not really uncommon in different cultures. Sometimes it's stigmatized and marginalized, but it's not uncommon. And sometimes trans and queer people are definitely revered in other cultures. And there's a link that we have on Blackboard with regard to two-spirit people as well. A link from The Guardian, which is kind of helpful to explain two-spirit people in indigenous cultures. Right. So the chapter begins with discussing how historically homosexuality definitely existed without sanctions in many ancient civilizations, ancient Rome, Greece, Babylon, China, Japan, and really it's existed everywhere throughout the world at all times, right? However, in the Western world, particularly starting in medieval Europe and later, homosexual relations were considered sinful, against nature, and were criminalized. And then later in the West, the homosexuality was actually considered an abnormality and a mental illness, and this was influenced by social and religious norms regarding gender and sexual orientation. This kind of stayed in place, this indication, labeling as an abnormality until 1973, when the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. Right, so Based on research, we do believe there are some neurologic or genetic components that determine sexual orientation and homosexuality, but it does appear biology plays some role. But however, it's probably not just one thing, but a combination of genetic, hormonal, and possibly environmental influences. So we, there's some research to that effect, but it is what it is. So anyway, in the United States, for the longest time, homosexuality was not considered something that you would discuss openly. Most people were, quote unquote, in the closet, right, with regard to whether they were gay or lesbian or bisexual, right. Homosexuality was criminalized in our country, and particularly this was enforced in the 1950s in our country. It was seen to be a very subversive and destabilizing threat to society. And I have a short advertisement. It's not really an advertisement. It's an instructional video, like you see a lot of these in the 1950s with regard to gender and dating and things like that. And this was a video called Boys Beware. And this was something that would be like on TV that you would watch. And it's like basically the threat of the homosexual man, trying to basically corrupt children, etc. So this kind of idea stuck with us in our country for the longest time, right? And in our country, and still today, back then particularly, but still today, LGBTQ plus people have suffered harassment, discrimination, imprisonment, firing from employment, violence, murder, particularly gay men and queer trans folk, particularly these days, non-white queer trans people, right? And because of social ostracization, particularly early in the 1900s, there were creations of some parallel institutions like social clubs, bars, social events, particularly in larger cities. And these oftentimes were raided by police. The patrons were beaten, thrown in jail, names were published in papers, etc. Right? So LGBTQ people for the longest time in our country faced not only violence from law enforcement, and they still do today, but also regular people, regular other citizens who target and verbally and physically attack them and kill them, right? So this has not changed in our country, although it has lessened considerably with regard to the rates from where it used to be. There was an uptick of it in the 1980s, particularly with regard to the AIDS crisis, right? However, lately, since 2016, there has been a marked increase in reported anti-LGBTQ violence and hate crimes, particularly against non-white, queer, and trans people, right? Book also a couple of things book talks about, and particularly this was something that it's kind of akin to with black folk, like this phenomenon of what's called passing, right? Where you would pretend to be straight, or if you were trans or queer, you would try to pass as your as a binary identity, right? So if you were a trans woman, you would try to pass as a woman, a cisgender woman, that one who identifies as a woman, right? That was assigned at birth, right? So cisgender means you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. Trans sometimes means you identify with what was not assigned at birth, right? But it's more fluid than that. But anyway, so like this phenomenon of passing, was a response to try to avoid discrimination and violence, right? Even in the 1950s, in particular, before the Civil Rights Movement, we did have some gay and lesbian rights groups, particularly in the larger cities, particularly in New York. The Mattachine Society for predominantly gay men, and the Daughters of Bilitis predominantly for gay women. And so there were a lot of social activities, political activities that were involved, and they started to begin to build cohesive communities and started to be a little bit more politically active. However, within these earlier communities, queer and trans folk were oftentimes excluded from these communities. So there was a marginalization even further of those who were queer and trans, and particularly if you were queer and trans of color, right? The modern LGBTQ rights movement was launched in not necessarily New York City, and other cities as well, San Francisco, but what we term now the modern LGBTQ rights movement was the groundbreaking event, the watershed event, was at a bar in Lower Manhattan called the Stonewall Inn. In 1969, police raided the bar, which they have raided this bar plenty times before, along with other bars, right? And in this raid, the patrons finally said they had enough and they fought back and they rioted. Starting on June 18th, 1969, during and after the police raid, they threw bricks, like glasses, whatever they can get their hands on at the police, drove the police away as they were arresting and beating up LGBTQ people. Right. So this event galvanized the LGBTQ community like no other, and it kind of lasted for several days. Right. And many people started to become more politically active afterwards, and this became the beginning of like things like LGBTQ pride parades and stuff. It's important to understand that there were other events similar to this before in other cities, but none that received so much attention as this one, right? It's also important to understand that in the telling of the story, you might watch videos about Stonewall, the Stonewall riots, and everything like that. The role of trans women, particularly trans women of color, has often been written out and pushed aside, and often we focus on just the white gay men did and their activism. So in that respect, I have another link in our content folder about two women in particular, two trans women, Marsha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And actually, New York City just honored them recently with a monument to their activism, right? So I have two links that you can watch look at, by yourself. Particularly highlighting Marsha Johnson, who was an incredible activist, and so was Sylvia Rivera as well, right? So then after Stonewall, right, we start to see some gains in the 1970s and very early 1980s. We start to see some gains in tolerance toward LGBTQ folk, and also an increase in anti-discrimination laws, particularly at some local and state levels. More LGBTQ people started to come out of the closet and were more visible in public sphere and everyday life. And then we had another period of increasing activism during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. Which hit the LGBTQ community very hard, particularly trans and queer people of color. We had organizations such as the AIDS Coalition Unleashed Power, it was called ACT UP, that took the government to task for failure to prioritize the AIDS epidemic. And it's important to understand that the president we had at that time, President Reagan, never mentioned publicly in a speech to the country AIDS until 1988, which was the last year of his presidency, which was rather pathetic. I was very young when this all happened, and I kind of remember this sort of stuff, right? I'm going to shut off the video very quickly because I'm running out of time on this one. So because of the AIDS epidemic, there was considerable backlash and the rise of conservative right. Also in the 1980s, this was influenced by right-wing religious and political conservatives, and there was a campaign launched against inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer folk in anti-discrimination legislation. So there's a huge backlash, and also a marked increase in violence against LGBTQ folk in the United States during the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. It was a rather scary time. So I am going to pause this, shut this video off, and we're going to move to the next video. So thank you very much, and on to video number 2.